All right. Hello, everybody. I will just give us a few more moments for everyone to join in. Welcome, welcome. All right. And so we are ready to begin. So I'll start off by welcoming you. My name is Amy Azapardi, and I am the current president of WALS here at Haub Law. I am honored to provide opening remarks for our 2022 Pioneer of Justice Awards ceremony, recognizing Elisabeth Lee. Now, to begin, I will provide a brief overview of our organization. The Women's Association of Law Students, WALS for short, is a student-run organization dedicated to raising awareness for law-related issues that predominantly affect women. Our group is one of the largest student organizations on campus and offers a forum for all of our community members and students to share information and support women. Above all, our primary goal is to improve the status of women in the legal profession and society at large. One of the key ways in which we reach these goals is by recognizing and celebrating the women in our society who take direct action to break glass ceilings and lay down a foundation for a more equal future. Upon these distinguished leaders, we bestow our annual Pioneer of Justice Award. Now, before I turn the floor over to Professor Crawford, I would like to take a moment to recognize our past WALS presidents, some of whom are here today. So, I have another slide. Okay, so I will turn the floor over to our past presidents to introduce yourselves.
Carly Grant, why don't you start us off?
Hi, I'm Carly Grant. I am a PACE alum or a Haub alum from 2008. I am currently in Chicago, Illinois of counsel at Tomlinson and Shapiro.
Danielle.
Hi, I'm Danielle Meeks. I graduated from PACE Law in 2014, and I currently am working for the City of New York in the Office of the General Counsel for the Administration for Children's Services.
Eve.
Hi, I'm Eve Lincoln. I graduated in December of 2016. I'm doing a couple different things right now. I guess my day job, I'm an attorney for the child for the county I live in, just a little north of Pace, Orange County. So practicing family law, mainly just focusing on the children's rights, whether it be custody cases or abuse cases or neglect or foster care or juvenile delinquency, all of that. I'm also a town councilwoman. Last year I was elected. I ran for office for the first time and I became our youngest town councilwoman ever. So I'm enjoying helping run our local government, doing a little bit of town law, contract law, and just making our town even more great for the families that live here. And also raising my two children. So you can definitely have it all, I would say. Thank you.
And Morgan.
Hi, my name is Morgan Weil, and I graduated in 2019. I joined my mother's firm in New Jersey, and we do arbitration work and estate planning. And we actually just started a page and, just to raise awareness to how to deal with dementia and the legal ramifications as well as financial ramifications that are involved.
That is wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us. Now I will turn the floor over to Professor Crawford, who is a distinguished professor here at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law and our WALS faculty advisor.
Thank you so much, Amy. I definitely feel like an interloper. This is a student event. It is organized by students for our largest student group on campus. But Amy asked me to just say a little bit about the Pioneer of Justice and Equality for Women in the Law Award. This award has been in existence since 1996. And the awardee is someone who's chosen for her contributions to the advancement of women through law. We've had some amazing awardees including Dr. Sarah Weddington, who was the attorney for the petitioner in Roe versus Wade, whom we have lost in the last year, Catherine McKinnon, the great feminist legal theorist, and several US elected representatives. And this year, the students chose our first international awardee, an elected representative from Australia. But I am going to ask my good friend and colleague Heather Roberts at the Australian National University to provide some context for those of us in the States who are lucky enough to hear from Elisabeth Lee today. Heather Roberts is an internationally recognized expert on women and the judiciary, constitutional law, feminist legal theory, and a great friend and participant in the US Feminist Judgments project. She also teaches in both the US and Australia in non-COVID times. So I've asked Heather Roberts to please provide for an international audience a little bit of context for some of the extraordinary work that our awardee has done. I'll turn it over to Professor Roberts.
Thank you so much, Bridget. It's an honor to be here with you and to be with WALS. And if you wonder why we're sitting so far from our camera, it's just we really wanted to make sure that we had a face-to-face celebration for Elisabeth Lee for the presentation of this award. So I'm sorry if you can't see the smiles on our faces so well, but it's because we want to make sure we have some applause here. I wanted to give a little bit of background into the distinctive and distinctly Australian context that is relevant, I think, in relation to honouring Elisabeth here today. In keeping with the brief I had from Bridget and Amy, I'd like to first reiterate how we opened the event here, which was to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and to pay our respects to elders past and present, and to celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of our region. In the context of International Women's Day, we also acknowledge the impact of the ongoing trauma of gendered violence faced by Indigenous Australians, including but not limited to the impact of the stolen generations. Now, of course, it's tomorrow here in Canberra, but one of the many ways in which we celebrated International Women's Day yesterday was the swearing in of a new Chief Justice of our court, Chief Justice Lucy McCallum. And she is the second woman to be appointed Chief Justice here, and her appointment brings the number of female judicial officers in the ACT, where ANU is located, to the position of almost gender equity. But that's not the case across the country. And it's certainly not the case across Australia's parliaments. Nor can we say that our country's parliaments exhibit the vibrant and dynamic racial diversity that we would hope for. And it's in this context of an over-representation of white male political leaders and a history of sexist and racist media and social media attacks on our female and non-white political leaders that the successful career and achievements of ANU Law alumna and member for Kurrajong, Elisabeth Lee, need to be understood and celebrated. Elisabeth Lee MLA was elected to member for Kurrajong in 2016. She was the first Korean Australian member of parliament in the ACT. And for our audience in the United States, just a reminder, ANU is located in Australia's national capital. Canberra is also the seat of our federal parliament, which is probably why you hear about Canberra more often. But Australia, like the United States, is a federal system and so comprises of state and territory legislative bodies, as well as the national parliament. So Canberra is here in the ACT. Each of the federal and state parliaments can enact criminal legislation in Australia. The other important piece of context that I believe will help you is that by virtue of our history as a British colony and the absence of a war of independence for Australia, Australian parliaments remain very strongly modelled off the Westminster parliamentary system. We don't have a strict separation of powers between the executive branch and the parliament, but rather the political party that wins the election forms a government. And key figures in that party take on cabinet positions such as Attorney General or Minister for Health or Minister for Education. In the ACT, the leader of the winning party becomes what we call the Chief Minister. Broadly speaking, the party that comes second in an election then forms opposition, and that party elects an opposition leader. It's important to know all this because in 2020, Elisabeth Lee became the first Asian Australian woman to become opposition leader in an Australian state or territory parliament. And her career is both remarkable in its achievements and bears many attributes of the resilience, work ethic and leadership that I believe have always defined migrants to Australia. Elisabeth came to Australia with her parents when she was in elementary school. English was not her first language, but that didn't stop her, or perhaps actually it inspired her to excel at school and to gain entry to the Australian National University and to complete her law and Asian studies degree here. A degree I'm also very proud to have completed here as well. We both then ended up teaching at ANU Law, where I first met Elisabeth. And in her classes, her passion for justice and using the power and privilege that a legal education provides became apparent. In 2016, she then decided to take those schools out of the law school and put those passions and attributes to work for the Canberra community by running for election in the ACT Legislative Assembly. She was successful and ultimately also took on the role of shadow or opposition Attorney General. Since her election to the Assembly in 2016, and particularly after assuming the mantle of the leader of the Canberra Liberal Party in 2020, Elisabeth has been a leading voice for improving our local schools, protecting the environment, and providing better support for Canberrans living with a disability and Canberrans from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. She's also spoken out about her own Me Too movement and as a moment and her work in that movement as a young lawyer who was sexually harassed by a very prominent Australian jurist. She's a trailblazer both as a woman and an Asian Australian in Parliament who strives to use her position to make it easier for those who come after her and make lives better for those who do not have a voice. And I think it's particularly one aspect of her advocacy and drive for change that caught the attention of the US audience. In 2021, Elisabeth introduced and secured the passage of the first legislation to explicitly criminalize the act of stealthing in Australia. Stealthing is the non-consensual removal of a condom during sexual intercourse, and there's significant research on the physical and psychological harm that stealthing causes and the fact that the practice has a disproportionate impact on women. Here in the ACT, there is a broader project for reforming consent laws in relation to sexual intercourse, and Elisabeth's bill was at the forefront of that reform and sent a clear message to all Territorians that stealthing is not okay, that it is an assault. She gained bipartisan support for her reform bill, which stemmed from her drive to make consent laws better. And for all of those reasons, for modelling for all of us leadership, motherhood, collegiality, and resilience in a pandemic, it's my very great pleasure to turn the floor back over to Amy, who'll present the award to Elisabeth Lee, MLA, ANU Law alumna, and my friend.
Thank you so much, Professor Roberts. It is my great pleasure on behalf of the Women's Association of Law Students at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law here at Pace University in New York to present our 2022 Pioneer of Justice and Equality Award to Elisabeth Lee. I now turn the floor over to Elisabeth Lee for some remarks.
Sorry, the run sheet says hold it for a bit.
Do you want me to take care of that?
Thank
for
you.
you,
Yes, please. Thank you for this incredible and tremendous honour. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the continuing contribution they make to our region and welcome any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us this morning. This is a really humbling moment to be given an award for doing my job. There are so many people who contribute to making our world a better place, but there are a few of us who have the great privilege of being able to introduce bills that eventually become law and create change for our world. And that is an incredible privilege of being a voice, of being an advocate, and of being a representative. Stealthing, as Heather mentioned, is the non-consensual removal of a condom during sex. The non-consensual removal of a condom during sex negates consent. Sexual intercourse without consent is rape, and rape is a crime. There is no doubt about the physical, psychological, and emotional harm that stealthing can impact on those who have experienced it. And really worryingly and tellingly, a Melbourne study actually found that 1 in 3 women and almost 1 in 5 men have been victims of stealthing. The reason that I brought my bill forward was because I don't want another person to ever be left wondering, was that rape? So I dedicate my award to the countless women and men who came forward and had the courage to come and talk to me about their experiences when I introduced the legislation and when I undertook consultation before it was passed with unanimous support in the ACT Legislative Assembly in October last year. And of course, with any work that is undertaken by a legislator, it can't be done alone. So I want to put on the record my thanks to Liam Devlin, who was my Deputy Chief of Staff. He was somebody that took the vision that I had and put it onto paper and helped with the stakeholder engagement and everything we needed to do to ensure we got the support to pass this bill. And also Georgia Clark, who's here with me this morning, who took on those reins and was there at the forefront when the bill was passed last year. Dr. Heather Roberts, those words were just so touching. Thank you so much. I will do everything that I can to live up to them because that was just incredible. So incredibly touched. Amy, to you, and also to the past presidents that were introduced just now. Morgan, Eve, Danielle, Carla, thank you for the incredible work that you do across the other side of the world to advance gender equality and justice for all, but especially, of course, our women. It is really telling on this International Women's Day, which I know it's still the day for you, and we had it yesterday. But I tell you, we celebrate this all month now. So it is a great occasion for celebration. And thank you, Dr. Crawford, for your words also. But it's also a time to reflect on how far we still have to go to achieve gender equality. And each of us, every single one of us, can play a role in achieving a more equal world, whether it's gender equality, also having the diversity in our public and political leadership that is accurately a reflection of what we see in our society. And as Heather mentioned, we don't see that at the moment in Australian parliaments. Although in the Australian Capital Territory, I'm very proud to lead a majority female party room in the opposition, but also to have been the first female majority parliament in Australia when we, as an ACT parliament, achieved that in 2016. But we all have a role to play. And can I say hats off to the blokes in the room today as well? Thank you for showing your support. So, and finally, I couldn't do what I do without the support that I have around me. And my partner Nathan is here joining me today. Thank you for doing what you do to support me so I can do what I do to try and serve our community in the best way possible. I want to conclude with a story, and that is the night that the bill passed. It was budget week for us, and I hadn't seen my 2-year-old daughter for about 48 hours because I'd go to work before she woke up. I'd come home after she'd gone to bed. But I made sure that I got home in time the evening that the bill passed, and she was eating dinner that Dad had cooked for her, sitting in her high chair. And I came home and I looked into her eyes and I said, "Hey, darling, we made history today and we passed some nation-leading laws." And while I was looking into her eyes, and it made me realize that I was doing my small part to make our world a much safer, a much more inclusive place for her and her generation. And that is a duty that I take seriously and will continue to do, to discharge what I can, because our world, our children and their children deserve nothing less. So again, thank you for this incredible honour. It is a tremendous, tremendous, humbling experience for me to receive this award. And of course, it is a dedication to all the brave women and men who came forward to share their experiences, because they know, as I do, that none of us want anyone else to feel that way again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. At this time, I welcome members of the audience who have questions or comments to write them in the chat and I can read them aloud. If we have anybody in the room with questions or comments, please feel free to, I suppose, raise your hand and maybe somebody can bring you a microphone. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions on my end, so I'm going to bring this on.
There is one.
Oh, okay, good.
Amy, you'll need to read that out for us because we can only see about half of it.
Yes, okay, so the question is from Professor Crawford, and it is, when we studied the ACT anti-stealthing legislation in class, some students expressed concern about the impacts of men of color. I suppose, do you have any comments about that?
So without knowing the context of the discussion around that.
There's a clarification. In other words, are men of color more likely to be impacted by the legislation when men of color are already disproportionately impacted by criminalization?
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really important question. And those are types of issues that, of course, Australian lawmakers and policymakers and academics also grapple with as well. There's no doubt that in Australia, we also see a disproportionately high rate of men with a different, I suppose, non-white background that are incarcerated. So certainly this is something that is not unique to the United States or Australia, but is something that I think the world does grapple with. And that's why it's incumbent on us as legislators and lawmakers to make sure that we acknowledge that. And it's also about ensuring that once we do pass laws, they don't just get forgotten. It is about continuous and constant reviewing and assessment to ensure that laws that the Parliament passes are having the intended impact that was the purpose in which the law was introduced and passed. And so this will be no different for me. I feel, of course, a personal ownership over this law. And it's something that we'll continue to work hard to make sure it doesn't have that disproportionate effect. And if there are legislative ways to secure that, then I'm absolutely open to making sure that we look into it.
Thank you.
Amy, I don't want to interrupt if there's another question from the US, but since we have Elisabeth here now, I wondered if you could just provide a little bit more context, particularly for the US audience, about what it was like from your perspective, to the extent that you can reveal things publicly that may happen within, party rooms. What happens? How do you get, you got the bill, oh, there we go. And we've got a question there. Just
I could read the question. It says, in California, the law's proponents ended up compromising by making stealthing a tort, not a crime. Was there a similar debate in Australia?
Yeah. So in terms of when I was looking into this, it was an incredibly new area of the law. And I think the only example we sort of had to go on at the time was a case in New Zealand where a man had been convicted of rape for a circumstance like this. And we had a pending case in Victoria without a decision at that time because COVID had put a stop on a lot of criminal trials. So it's a really interesting development in California, because I think in Australia that, I mean, Professor Bartels might know better, but I don't think we had discussed it in any great public way about whether it should be a tort or a crime. Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting, and it would be something that would be good to look at. The ACT is currently going through some broader reforms on consent. And so this will continue to be in the public domain. I'm actually, so this is the first time that we sort of had raised as whether that should be a tort. So it's something that will be really, really interesting to look at, particularly in the context of when we start seeing what happens in California and what happens under the new laws there. So so I suppose the answer is we haven't quite looked at it yet, but it's definitely something is worthwhile pursuing. Yeah.
And we have another question in the chat. Some students asked how stealthing is more or less a harm than having intercourse without telling one's partner that one has a sexually transmitted infection.
I don't know that it's a mutually exclusive thing. It's something that you can have a gradient on, like, one thing's worse than the other. I think when you're talking about some of the most intimate and vulnerable of moments, any breach of trust is incredibly damaging. And it's something that I think lawmakers have always grappled with in the beginning, because, you don't want legislators in the bedroom, and all the way through to, it's too hard to prove, all the way through to, if we turn a blind eye, then it doesn't happen, right? And I think community and society attitudes have come a really long way to breaking down the stigma and making sure that people do have the courage, who do speak up, are supported. And that is not going to be based on law reform alone. I think it is a whole of society response. So yeah, certainly it's not to say that it's more or less harmful than anything else, but it had been something that was raised with me last term before I was later, and it was something that when the March for Justice movement happened in Australia in March last year, that sort of raised with me, you know what, I feel so helpless, but I'm a legislator, what can I do? And it was a start. And I was always very clear from the beginning that law reform alone isn't going to change behaviour, but it is really important for the law to try and accurately reflect what we as a society have deemed as unacceptable.
We have another question in the chat. What is the level of proof required for conviction? In the US, we have such a challenge with sexual assault convictions because of they said versus they said scenarios.
And that's a really, really interesting question. And it was something that was raised with me, especially by the lawyers about what happens. We know that the rates of conviction when it comes to sexual violence or sexual offences is incredibly low. And with stealthing, it would probably be even lower. Most of the time, because either the victim doesn't realise what's happened, or because it's such a murky area, they don't realise it is assault. And so we do know that. The response that I had when that was raised with me was, we shouldn't be forging ahead with good law reform just because it's hard to convict. Because whilst, of course, the conviction rates may be difficult to overcome, our laws also play a massive role in deterrence and education. If we can say to our community very, very, very clearly, this is illegal, this is criminal conduct, this is unacceptable to our society, I think it still plays an important role in changing behaviour.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat. Do you have any advice for law students in Australia or in the US who are interested in getting involved in lawmaking efforts, but may not be able to walk away from a job as a private firm attorney?
Yeah, and I think this is a challenge that faces all law students and lawyers as well. You know, it's funny because it kind of reminds me of when people said to me, do you miss the law? And I went after I'd left private practice. And I said, I'm still in the law. I'm just, you know, playing a different arm to it. So instead of practicing it, I'm now very privileged to make law as a legislator. So on the flip side, as we have the privilege of making laws in the logistic and practical sense, we certainly take on board the learnings and the movements from our profession across the board. Lawyers who work in NGOs, lawyers who work in private practice, lawyers who work in government, law academics. And it's really important because our laws should reflect what we as a society as a whole deems to be acceptable and unacceptable. And so don't dismiss the role that you are already playing as a private practitioner in contributing to law reform. That's number one. But number two is also get to know your local members and representatives and talk to them, because I'll tell you, like, you know, for me and my colleagues, for most of us, it's really important to get the temperature from our colleagues and from those around us. And this is why it's so important for our parliaments to reflect the diversity of our community, because we do end up talking to our circles. We do end up being influenced by our circles on issues that we want to raise for public debate in our parliaments. And that's why if it's a homogenous group, it doesn't lead to good outcomes. We need that diversity so that every single person in our community's voice can be captured.
And then we have another question in the chat. Now that you are a legislator, what surprised you about, quote unquote, how the sausage gets made? Is there a way that law schools could better prepare graduates to engage in the legislative arena?
That's a really, really interesting question because, as I say, don't ever go behind the scene and see how sausages are made, right? You'd never eat a sausage again. One of the things that surprised me, I suppose, the most, and particularly as somebody who practiced and was a law academic before I was elected, was just how much non-legal stuff goes into making law. I know it sounds really counterintuitive, but what I mean by that is elected members have limited time. There's a lot of legislation that comes before your desk, and it is impossible to read through, research, engage and do consultation on every single piece of legislation that comes before you. So you end up doing what everyone does when that happens, and that is to prioritize. And so it can be a very difficult juggling task. In terms of for law students, preparing for a future in legislative making, I suppose, is, I would say, go and get some life experience. More important, and I hate to say this because we're in law school, law studies are important. Don't get me wrong, law studies are important, but more important than that is actually your life experience that you can bring to being a legislator. You know, because we can all look at black and white what the law might be, but it's that real life experience of how that law impacts someone, a certain group of people, and that goes back to the original question about, you know, disproportionate impact on coloured men. And it's really, really important to have that life experience. So I would say to any law student, you know what, it doesn't matter what the experience is, go get some experience, life experience, and come into the legislature with a broader view of the world.
Thank you. I believe that was the final question. I don't know if anybody in the room has any questions.
Well, I wondered if we could just tap Elisabeth's brain a little bit more. Here in Canberra, we've probably all seen various things on television about US parliaments and how they work. Now, we all know that television is not necessarily a reflection of the reality, but based on your knowledge of the ACT parliamentary process and the snippets we see that project a certain image of legislative processes in the US, do you want to reflect a bit more on what your experience was getting this bill through?
So it's interesting because ACT is a very, very small jurisdiction. So we have a unicameral parliament of 25 members, 5 members elected from 5 electorates. So it's a very broad-ranging parliament, but at the same time, it's also a very close parliament. And each of us very much is heavily engaged with the communities that we serve. So it's very different to federal parliament, and I'm guessing in the US as well, where you sort of fly in, fly out. It's very, very different, you know, so we live in the communities that we serve. And I think that makes a huge difference in terms of the perspective that you bring to your work as a legislator. ACT Parliament, I mean, come on, let's be honest, we'll be lucky to get 7 people viewing our proceedings of annual reports and estimates. US, you get, you know, international media in terms of the lawmakers doing what they do over there. But what is really stark, I think, and quite a big difference is I think in the United States, and I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but especially for law graduates, there is a huge focus on advocacy. So I've always found American lawyers very articulate and very, very good, I suppose, you know, they're very good at public speaking and they're very, very articulate when it comes to oral presentations. In Australia, our law school system is slightly different. So you could theoretically get all the way through law school without having once given an oral presentation. And, you know, you don't necessarily go and practice in the sense of going to court and being an advocate. So there is a very different approach and delivery that I find in terms of Australian law graduates and US law graduates. And also in politics, one of the things that I strongly believe about our democratic system, and it's not perfect, but it's certainly better than others around the world, is that it should be something that is open for anyone from any walk of life to put their hand up to be a part of. It doesn't have to be a certain class of people. It doesn't have to be certain people who have only graduated from X degree. And that's a really, really, really strong and important aspect of our democratic system that I will defend to the hilt. It is so important. And again, that goes back to the diversity that we want to see in our parliaments. You know, and I know that US has also grappled with that, making sure that you see a diversity across the cross-section of our community to be elected members. And I think that work continues. I have done some work with the Korean overseas politicians, and there are a lot of Korean Americans who have been involved with that organisation. And I know that, you know, they very much support each other because, again, it's about that diversity in the elected members' ranks. You know, as somebody who is the first Korean Australian elected member and the first Asian Australian elected leader of a major party, I certainly know that I have a role to play in that. Because let's face it, when I was a 7-year-old Korean girl migrant living in Western Sydney, and all I saw on TV about politics was middle-aged white men yelling at each other across a table, I couldn't even dream that I would ever have a role in Australian politics. It's just not something you fathom because it just is not a world that I belong in. And so my hope is that for the next generation, if they see the diversity of faces, you know, representing politics, then that's going to say, hey, you know what, I can be there. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll do a final call for questions or comments.
They won't be able to hear you. I was just going to ask what's next in this space for you. I know that you mentioned that the consent conversation is ongoing, and yeah, what the sort of most important aspects of that are for you.
I think it's important that our laws are not sort of become dusty pieces of paper. It's important that the laws are alive and continue to stay alive as society progresses and moves forward. So with the broader consent work that is happening in the ACT, we will of course engage very, very much with that reform. There are also other aspects of, I suppose, gender equality work that is happening. And there's at the moment a push for, and I noticed that some of the previous winners of the Pioneer of Justice Award were recognised for their work in menstrual equality. And I think that's a really important next step. So for example, New South Wales, and we're an island within the state of New South Wales, has just come out to say that they will make sure they provide period products in every public school so that no student goes without. Recently, we've had feedback that our public hospitals don't provide period products. And I heard a horrible, horrible story of a woman who presented to hospital, ended up having a miscarriage and needed pads, very heavy pads, and the hospital basically said, did you not bring any? And she had to say, well, I didn't expect to miscarry at the hospital. So I think that's just a horrendous situation. And for Canberra, which is one of the most affluent and highly educated cities in Australia, maybe even the world, to have somebody in that situation is just unacceptable. So there's some other stuff that is definitely on the agenda for moving forward in terms of, you know, doing step by step what we can to achieve gender equality.
Any last questions? All right, so I will share my screen once more just to give a special thanks. I just wanted to thank Ms. Lee, Professor Roberts, Professor Crawford, and everyone who assisted in planning this event and getting the trophy and all parts of setting up the Zooms and everything. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of WALS. We do sincerely appreciate your efforts and all of the hard work that went into planning this event. I just want to say if there's any PACE students on the call that have questions that are pressing, you can find my contact information on our TWEN page, and I would be happy to put you into contact with anyone that you heard from today. So on that note, thank you again, and I wish everyone a good night / good morning, depending on where you are in the world, and thank you again.